Terrific. We're on time. Welcome to KEI and to our first event of the new year. We have a terrific one to start with. I'm Mark Coppola, the Vice President of KEI, and I'm going to start with our shameless plug. KEI is a think tank and public outreach organization dedicated to helping Americans understand the breadth and importance of our relationship with the Republic of Korea. If you'd like to learn more about our activities, including our podcasts and blogs and publications and events, I would refer you to our website, which is keia.org. Today we're discussing Northeast Asia and the new Congress with a stellar panel, including Congressman Charles Boustany, Counselor and Chair of the Center for Innovation, Trade and Strategy at the National Bureau of Asian Research, our very own Ambassador Kathy Stevens, President and CEO of KEI, Ambassador Jim Zumwalt, CEO of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, and Ambassador Joseph Yoon, Senior Advisor to the Asia Center, U.S. Institute of Peace. If I went through their achievements and positions of influence, it would take too long. So their bios are in your programs. You can catch up there. So welcome all. We'll start right up with a question for Ambassador Yoon. Before we talk about the new Congress, let's look back at the last Congress briefly. On New Year's Eve, President Trump signed into law the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, wonderful acronym ARIA, which dealt with, in part, U.S. policy toward North Korea. Could you give some insight on that legislation?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Maybe before I answer your question, thanks for having us here. And I see this is where all the former ambassadors end up, you know. But still, it's good to be with my former boss, Kathy, and of course my colleagues, Jim and Mark. Well, thank you. On ARIA, I do want to emphasize that foreign policy in general is within the purview of the executive branch. And so what you're seeing in ARIA, I think, is an excellent summary of kind of bipartisan consensus on what U.S. policy towards Asia should be. It has good chapters on Korea, Southeast Asia, China, Taiwan, South China Sea, ASEAN, and all the human rights and all that. But I think, and you saw that when President Trump signed it, he said, I'm signing it, but I'm going to ignore it, So I think that's where it is. But obviously, we have a former Congressman, Boustany, here. There is an important role for Congress. And we're now facing, essentially, with midterm election, Democrats having won the House. So it will be different dynamics. But I think you should see ARIA as what I call sense of Congress, especially previous Congress, is going to be, teach us what the consensus is. But beyond that, items like, in North Korea or Korean Peninsula, that there should be no pull out of the troops, that's completely within the administration branch.
Okay, that's good and sets up the question for Congressman Boustany, logically. For the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the president had the advantage of a Republican Congress. Now the Democrats control the House. How will dynamics between the administration and the Congress change?
Well, they're off to an auspicious start with the ongoing shutdown, and who knows how long that's going to last, but it's going to quickly, if it keeps going, it's going to dovetail into the budget planning and appropriations process for the next fiscal year. So things aren't off to a very good start right now. I expect on the a couple of dynamics. One, you have a number of senators on the Democratic side of the aisle who are either contemplating or actively making plans to run for president. And they're going to be competing with each other for media attention to see who can get the upper hand to ultimately win the Democratic nomination. At the same time, so they'll be using that stage, but they will also play off of the democratically controlled House and looking to pick up support among members of the progressive wing of the party and so forth. So this is going to be an interesting dynamic. I think what we're going to see will be a lot of investigations in the House because Democrats will control the agenda, whereas in the Senate, they don't. So I expect a number of oversight and investigative hearings. Some of these will be focused on real issues, on taxes and health care and what's going on in the state of play. Others are going to be more political, whether relating back to the Mueller investigation, Trump's tax returns. So a lot of this will happen on the political side of it. Much of what will happen over the next 2 years should be seen through the prism of presidential politics for 2020, and also the competition in 2020 for the House and the Senate. So I think politics will dominate. If you keep that in mind, it's a good way to kind of interpret what's happening.
Okay, to follow up a bit, what powers does Congress have other than investigative powers if they disagree with the administration on trade or foreign policy?
Right. Well, I mentioned hearings. Congress can raise the public level of attention to certain issues using hearings. Congress is vested with the power of the purse, appropriations. So even with regard to, now the key point here is that Congress oftentimes does not use that with regard to the executive branch in the area of foreign policy, but they certainly could use it in the appropriations process with amendments and so forth, limitation amendments on funding and so forth. So they can use those kinds of tools. Of course, there's the issue of passing sanctions. We saw this with the Russia sanctions bill. A very robust package was passed in both House and Senate with overwhelming numbers. The president, the numbers were such that the president would not be able to override or the House could override any veto. House or Senate could override veto. So president was forced basically to implement those sanctions, even though he, I think, had a signing statement to the contrary. And then in trade policy, foreign economic policy more broadly, Congress has considerable tools going all the way back to Article 1 of the Constitution, with Trade Promotion Authority, which kind of really sets the stage for how trade agreements are done. So there are considerable tools that Congress can use to balance out the executive branch. The question is, to what extent and how aggressive will Congress be in choosing to use those tools?
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Zumwalt, since taking office, President Trump has challenged traditional notions of U.S. alliances with global partners. One of the ways he's done this is to criticize allies such as South Korea for not paying more burden sharing for defense. How do you see the new Congress handling the White House's position on alliances? And how could that affect our relationships with South Korea and Japan?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I wanted to thank KEI for the wonderful collaboration with Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Just a brief advertisement. We're an organization focused on strengthening U.S.-Japan relations. And when I and Mark and Kathy and Joe were in government, we were all working to promote a strong U.S.-Japan-Korea trilateral relationship. So now that we're in the private sector, we thought it was useful to prove that organizations focused on Japan and Korea can collaborate and work together to promote common interests. So thank you very much for hosting this event today. Getting back to your question, though, you're correct that President Trump himself has challenged the value of alliances. But if you look at the national security strategy of the U.S. government, which is issued by the Trump administration, it talks about the importance of alliances in dealing with the major challenge facing the United States, which is the emergence of competitors who don't share our interests, China and Russia in particular. So there is a dichotomy perhaps between things the president has said both as a candidate and to a lesser extent after election and what his administration is saying. One particular issue right now that's of interest to the Trump administration has been the host nation support negotiations. Right now, the United States and Korea have been negotiating the amount of money which the Korean government would pay the United States, and soon the United States will begin negotiations with Japan on this as well. But I think the point I always make is the U.S. forces in the region, both in Japan and Korea, are there partly for defense of Japan and defense of Korea, but they also are there to promote peace and security in the region, which is in the United States' interest. So it really is in our own interest for the United States to forward deploy troops in the region. And in fact, in the case of Japan, Japan pays the United States $1.6 billion per year as its contribution to the alliance. That covers the salaries of 24,000 base workers. These are electricians and plumbers and so forth who work on U.S. bases in Japan. Also 60% of the utility cost for electricity, water, and so forth, and training relocation. So if we were actually to bring our forces from Japan home to the United States and maintain the same capability, the U.S. taxpayer would have a higher bill to pay. So it's not a burden on the United States. It's actually a cost savings measure. I think you could make the same argument for U.S. troops in Korea. So I think it's important for people to understand that we are there because it's in our interest. It's also in Japan and Korea's interest, but it's in our interest fundamentally.
I think if I may, it's good that KEI and Sasakawa, we're doing very well in Washington in cooperating the two. I think the problem is between the two big capitals.
But we can model good behavior, perhaps.
Yeah, right.
But I was just going to ask Jim, I mean, of course, on the U.S. South Korea burden sharing agreement, that negotiation is still ongoing, notwithstanding the fact that the previous one expired at the end of 2018. I've forgotten, what's the timetable for Japan's renegotiation?
Yeah, actually, we have the current agreement goes for 2 more years.
Okay.
So
You're lucky.
we should be starting soon. But I think the plan had been to conclude the agreement with South Korea and then start talks with Japan. And obviously now, because it's the same negotiators who do all of these agreements. So I'm sure the Japanese are quite concerned about the failure between the United States and Korea to reach agreement, because for them it's reassuring to see what the ROK agrees to.
Ambassador Stevens, the ongoing partial government shutdown shows how partisan politics in Washington can lead to policy deadlocks. You've had the chance to be overseas during your career looking at U.S. domestic politics from abroad with your foreign colleagues. Will domestic political turmoil affect U.S. policy towards Northeast Asia? How will they view it?
Yeah. One thing, those of us who are former career diplomats, is we always try to stay away from talking too much about our own domestic politics. We were perfectly happy to talk about everybody else's. So I still feel a certain sense of discomfort. But, a couple of observations. One, and I think many people in this audience know it, but it would be hard to, I guess, exaggerate the attention to which other countries pay to our politics, which we don't particularly reciprocate, right? So the United States and our politics, whether it's President Trump or anybody else, loom pretty large in these capitals. That said, I've actually debated with some of my friends, both American and Korean, and actually Japanese, are in the case of Seoul and Tokyo, are the respective governments and publics there kind of underestimating or overestimating the potential for disruption in the relationships coming from our own very unusual political situation right now. And we perhaps can debate that among ourselves as well. I guess it obviously depends a little bit on how you look on the situation here. You could point to certainly, specific actions or lack of actions that are taken, and we just talked about the failure to complete a negotiation, whether you consider that to be dysfunction or just tough negotiating, again, is in the eye of the beholder, but that's of concern, as we've already mentioned. It's of concern when an announcement is made about withdrawal of troops from Syria, and then it appears that's being walked back. And again, aside from the substance of the policy itself, the process is something that's watched very closely from capitals. The absence of consultation with affected stakeholders or even consultation within the interagency process. These are sophisticated partners we have in these countries, and they watch that, and it concerns them because it means they don't know how to use their levers, if you like, of influence and input and consultation to try to manage the relationship. Certainly the example of the announcement after the summit in Singapore of the suspension of military exercises. Again, while I think many people would have agreed, and some would not have agreed, that this was a useful thing to do, the absence of consultation was significant. But in terms of, what we call our own domestic politics, I was kind of taken with an article that a former colleague of mine and friend, Dan Snyder, who many of you know at Stanford University, wrote for a Japanese audience. I don't know, Jim, if you saw it, but he titled it, I thought this was good for an Asian audience, see if I could say, The 5 Crises in the United States. And his aim was to try to say to a Japanese audience, you're not paying, well, I shouldn't speak for him, but I sort of took from it, you need to pay attention to this. And I'm not going to read his article, but I commend it to you. He had the 5 crises he identified. He called them distinct but converging crises that the U.S. faces in 2019. A political crisis, an economic crisis, a foreign and national security crisis, governability, or I guess I call it dysfunction crisis, and potentially a legal and constitutional one. So then, you can read the article for the details, but I think we all know enough about what's going on here. You can kind of fill that in pretty quickly. Now, obviously, well, at least my crystal ball for 2019 is pretty cloudy, but I think there is kind of a question of to what extent do these capitals, are they paying attention to this? How do they weigh it? We have enough trouble here within the bubble of Washington weighing that. And how are they going to respond? And I do think people will respond in different ways. Some will see this as an opportunity to play, or even a necessity to play a different role vis-a-vis the United States, to begin to hedge perhaps against U.S. Unpredictability or unreliability, and so on. So I think it's a very, very important year, even more than, in addition to already entering our presidential season, for domestic politics to affect how our both allies and other partners as well as rivals are going to position themselves vis-a-vis the United States.
If I could add something, early case in point, when President Trump, very early, a day or so into his administration, pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Japan quickly engaged in a way that we've not seen Japan engage before, to pull the other countries together and showed demonstrable leadership in getting CPTPP done, and now that's going into effect. It's going to have a big impact, I think, in global with regard to global trade. But that was an early example, and I think we're starting to see other countries really start taking stronger initiatives on their own and looking at the U.S. as, well, they're taking a hiatus from the international stage, from the leadership of the global order, and we're going to have to figure this out ourselves.
I've tried to explain to some of my foreign colleagues that it used to be in the old days, pre-Trump, that when the president said something, it was the end of a policy debate process analysis. It was conclusion. But the way it is now, when President Trump makes an announcement, it tends to be the beginning of the debate. It's the beginning of the process.
Well, Mark, and two, the other case in point is the situation that triggered the sudden resignation of Secretary Mattis. That was a very disruptive set of circumstances where senior-most cabinet members apparently did not know what was coming with the sudden announcement of a withdrawal of troops from Syria. And I'm sure it caused consternation among our Asian allies with regard to that kind of process and the uncertainty attending that kind of process.
It's transparent. We have a transparent system now. Unsurprisingly, let's move on to North Korea. I'd like to ask each of you in turn, kind of work down the line here, what do you think some of the key steps that we need to see are in negotiations with North Korea? And what are some of your main concerns going forward? So, Ambassador Ewan, can I hit you with that first?
Well, thank you very much, Mark. So today we're seeing, nice footage from Beijing, Kim Jong-un going to China, and essentially this is pretty much the repeat of last year when he went to China to get the green light from Xi Jinping that it is okay to have another summit with Trump. And so I do think that a second summit will be arranged quite soon, probably at the end of February or early March or so. So this is another example, by the way, Congressman, of Kim Jong-un taking advantage of the situation in Washington and going to China, number one, not only to get permission from Xi Jinping, but to send a message, underlying message to Washington, to Trump, being that, hey, you're not the only game in town. I have this big China card to play, So I think there is a dual message there. I think it would be a mistake if there is no kind of pre-arrangement on what the goals are and agreement on the steps towards denuclearization before we do a second summit with Kim Jong-un. This will just mean repeat of what happened in Singapore. Once is enough, but the second time to go there and come back with nothing, I think would be a mistake. It would be a mistake because it really does mean we are giving in to North Korea's attempt, legitimized as a nuclear weapon state. And, this virtually means we're acquiescing. I don't think we can acknowledge or recognize our North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, but twice that we're acquiescing. It's not as though previous presidents, Clinton, Bush, Obama, it's not as though they didn't have opportunity to meet with North Korean leader, but to do that for them, they felt was legitimizing North Korea, especially in its possession of nuclear weapons. So I think, if we do that second time without concrete steps towards denuclearization being agreed, it will be very bad news for worldwide non-proliferation. It will be very bad news for South Korea and Japan, our allies. And worst of all, this is very bad news for Homeland Security because these weapons are legitimate threats.
Well, I agree with Joe, not surprisingly, and I guess I try to build on what he said by saying when it comes to what that concrete menu is of denuclearization steps, and probably I don't know if matched by some reciprocal measure on the part of the United States or in the inter-Korean process. We have several strands going here. The inter-Korean process, the denuclearization process. And we have Kim Jong-un, on January 1st, making some statements, some of which showed some promise. I think there are elements that can be worked on and where we could have a concrete progress that could be announced at a next summit. But to get there, now I'm going to focus on the process. There needs to be a process, and that's what's been lacking. I think that clearly the thing that's been most lacking is any communication between Pyongyang and Washington, except kind of through the press, I guess, or through public announcements. There needs to be some kind of process, and there it seems, at least from where I can read it, that the responsibility lies mostly in Pyongyang, where they've kind of held back in engaging in that way. At the same time, I think we need to really deepen the process, if you like, of consultation with Seoul and also with others in the region. I mean, Kim Jong-un going to China is a reminder, and probably a very explicit one, that China has both equity and influence in this. I'm not here to advocate a return to the SixParty Talks, but I am to say this is a regional issue. And U.S. diplomacy works best when we do work together with not only our allies and partners, which is very important, but also with the others who can bring influence to bear. And I think there's been not enough attention to that as well.
Well, I don't have the same level of expertise as my two colleagues here with this, but I fully agree the process has been lacking in this, and that's a real concern. But secondly, there seems to be this dancing around about the sequencing and this whole definition of denuclearization that has not been addressed. And until that's worked out, I think this is not going to lead to any kind of a good outcome for us. And I think we'll end up back to where we were after where we saw breakdown of talks in the past as a result. So I'm very concerned. I don't think the administration has put the kind of thought into those kinds of details that would be needed to get to an acceptable agreement.
I just wanted to echo what Kathy said about process, but just to flesh that out a little bit, the reason why there's a need for a process, or several reasons, but one is, as the United States, we have to think about what are our interests in the region. Promoting democratic values and human rights is one. Assuring regional peace and security is another. So as we negotiate with North Korea, we can't only think about the bilateral negotiation, we have to think about the impact on these other interests we have. And that's where a process can help you think about all of these issues. But the second aspect of a process is working with our friends, allies, and regional partners. And I don't see any solution with North Korea that can be achieved solely in a bilateral negotiation. We need China, we need Korea, we need Japan as part of that. So we need some kind of a process to coordinate what we're doing with others so we're rowing in the same direction.
It shows things are different now. I mean, in previous times, you wouldn't have had a summit until you'd gotten past the impasse. The impasse seems to be North Korea asking for sanctions relief first, and the U.S. asking for the roadmap on denuclearization first. So you'd have to resolve that and then have the leaders meet. But in this era, I wonder if President Trump doesn't see the second summit as being the way to break the impasse, which is a high-risk kind of operation. We're here to talk about Congress. Let's kind of get back to North Korea and Congress. So for Ambassador Stevens and for Congressman Boustany, there's a long history of bipartisan agreements on North Korea in Congress. Do you think that's going to continue in the new Congress, or is potential for that consensus to erode?
Well, I would there's a slight issue with the way you framed it in the sense that I do think that there's been, and I don't know if the congressman agree, but overall broad bipartisan consensus with the U.S. approach to the Korean Peninsula, to our alliances, to the commitment to seeing a Korean Peninsula without nuclear weapons. And as Joe mentioned, I think that's underscored in the ARIA, and that's kind of a baseline for Congress. At the same time, I mean, the North Korean issue has been a politically controversial, both between parties and within parties, and indeed within administrations at various times. And in terms of, I would say, a lack of bipartisan agreement was probably most evident back in the 1990s over the agreed framework. Which was reached just during the Clinton administration, just before the midterms, when the Democrats suffered great losses. And the Republicans in Congress then subsequently were very skeptical and tried to use the purse strings to express their unhappiness. And I think many people think that was one of the reasons that the agreed framework was not really able to get the kind of traction. There may have been some others, but that's an historical discussion to have. So bipartisan, yes, but there's also certainly been an issue of great debate within the Congress. I'll defer to the congressman on where we are now, but I would take from ARIA and from the fact that on the Democratic side, as you say, we not only have a new Democratic majority in the House, we have almost as many new prospective candidates for president on the Democratic side, and they will be looking to express their foreign policy views. And my own sense is so far, and I think probably going forward, they will be underscoring, if you like, that more traditional view of the importance of alliance relationships, the importance of denuclearized North Korea, and so on, and that those are things that, again, mainstream, I think, Republicans sign up to as well. So it's kind of an odd situation I think we're in terms of where you might have the Democrats actually being a little more strict, if you like, about what they might expect, for example, in any negotiation vis-a-vis denuclearization and sanctions relief, and a bit of a role reversal almost to where maybe things were during periods in the SixParty Talks and earlier.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with all of that. I think a couple of observations. There's broad consensus among the parties, and it's reflected in votes in the past with regard to the security issues, as well as the human rights issues and some of the economic issues dealing with the peninsula. But I think there will be, a pretty vigorous oversight attempt by the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Elliot Engel to look at the process and how they've gone about, what steps they've taken, where they've fumbled the ball on this to create some separation from a party standpoint. Secondly, if you look at the Senate now, we have a new Senate Foreign Relations chairman. Bob Corker was very outspoken on these issues. He was, looking to grab turf and to demonstrate leadership from the legislative branch side in foreign policy from his perch as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. With a new chairman coming in, he's sort of an unknown on this. And what I'm hearing is that most expect that he'll sort of fall in line with the Trump view and certainly not be as questioning of the Trump administration approach as Corker might have been. Corker was, basically more independent as a voice on these things. So I would expect on the Senate side a little more muted approach, at least among Senate Republicans there, at least from the chairman and so forth. But I expect some fireworks in the House on this.
Let me do a follow-up for you, Congressman. You're the one person on the stage that probably has more perspective about where Korea fits into the kind of national consciousness or what Congress is up to. From the KI perspective, we tend to do Korea every day, so we think Korea is really important. From your point of view, how important is Korea to the Congress or the public now?
Well, I think it's very, very important. First of all, I think there's a broad acceptance of the threat, whether it's on proliferation issues, the direct threat that North Korea poses to allies in the region, and now apparently to the U.S. mainland. So those are big issues. I think there's a broad consensus on the human rights issues. And broad consensus that North Korea has been a bad actor for a long time, fueling a lot of problems. If you look at trade agreements, the chorus probably achieved the biggest bipartisan vote among agreements passed over the last decade or so. So I think there's a sense that these economic issues are quite important. To the extent that I don't know how important Congress recognizes Korea to the peninsula itself to be with regard to how Belt and Road's going to play out, and this pull back and forth on what South Korea does. Does it lean more toward China and Belt and Road initiatives? How does it straddle that? And then there's an energy component as well, where I think Russia's making a play to provide more energy to South Korea through a route that would involve possibly building a pipeline through North Korea to the south, or more collaboration on the peninsula on energy issues. Some of these things, I don't know if Congress is paying close attention to it broadly. There may be some members who are doing so, and I hope they are, because I think what happens on the peninsula is vitally important for U.S. national interest, and certainly our alliance with South Korea is critical from a security standpoint and the economic partnership as well.
Yeah, and Ambassador Zumwalt, where do you think Japan figures in the national consciousness, either the public or the Congress?
No, thank you for that very good question. And if I could maybe shift a little bit to a more of an economic focus, because I think one of the big issues that Congress will be at least thinking about going forward is our trade policy with Japan. And we're in a very unusual situation right now where the United States worked very hard to negotiate a very good market access agreement with Japan in the context of TPP. So we obtained major concessions on cuts in tariffs on beef, on pork, on wine, and other products. And now, ironically, because we pulled out of that agreement, the work we did to negotiate these concessions benefits our competitors. So New Zealand and Australia are now exporting beef to Japan and paying about 2/3 of the tariff that American beef exporters are paying, thanks to U.S. trade negotiators. In April 1st, the Japan-EU FTA will come into effect, and U.S. pork exporters will be paying 30% more tariffs than Spanish and Danish pork exporters. So we're going to start losing market share in Japan. It's an $11 billion market for U.S. agricultural exporters. Thanks to U.S. negotiators. This is what we did. So I think because the president doesn't recognize the impact of withdrawal from TPP. And by the way, Japan has taken a very interesting approach. Rather than retaliating on the United States for our imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum like China did, like the EU did, Japan has said, well, we're going to be cutting tariffs for your competitors as we've agreed to. So in a way, we're facing the pressure, but it's our own doing. So one thing I think Congress could do is start highlighting, because U.S. agricultural interests are quite concerned. They're already reporting that their partners in Japan are looking to the EU, looking to Australia, because they're looking for the best price they can get. And so these things are going to be occurring. So I think one thing Congress could do is start highlighting some of the costs of U.S. trade policy, and perhaps getting to a consensus that we need to be negotiating an FTA with Japan, either bilateral or going back to a TPP type arrangement.
Yeah, I'm glad you're raising the trade economic issues because they're fundamental, and we'll get back to those. Let me do a few more things in North Korea first, kind of wrap up that part of it. Mm-hmm. So, Ambassador Yoon, are there steps Congress could take that would actually help in the negotiations with North Korea?
I don't think so.
Fair enough. Some people like to argue that Congress can play the tough role, but these are different days. And I'd like to get back to human rights, too, for Ambassador Stevens. In 2016, President Trump was rather vociferous about the North Korean human rights problems. Another dialogue has started. He's not been raising that issue. So do you think that the administration or Congress will try to keep human rights on the agenda?
Well, I turned to Congressman Boustany too, but my sense in terms of Congress is that yes, I think they will. There are some members, including now some moving into leadership positions in the House with longstanding interest and commitment to highlighting and trying to address the situation of human rights abuses in North Korea. And I would expect we'll hear something about that. It's also notable that the President, the administration, has not nominated, as far as I know, right, a new special envoy. I'm looking at our former special envoy on North Korean human rights issues, which is required by law. Of course, there are many vacancies at the State Department and a number of nominations that have not yet been made, but we are 2 years into the administration and not yet nominated. So I would imagine that would be a question that would come up in the Congress and certainly is being asked in the region. So no, I guess I'm not being as brief as Joe was, but all indications are that President Trump is taking a different tack right now with North Korea, and it does not include highlighting the human rights situation. I would just add, I think it is important to highlight. I think it's also important to address the humanitarian situations in North Korea. And one thing that really concerned, I think, a lot of people in this town and elsewhere is the very, very strict, I guess, would be the kind of approach that the U.S. administration was taking to granting humanitarian exceptions to sanctions to allow various kinds of, again, this is not human rights in that more traditional sense, but humanitarian relief to address some of the really serious health and humanitarian issues in North Korea. I do think that there's a way of engaging on this, and in particular, I would also say with Seoul, where sometimes it could be a sensitive topic, where you can come up with not only the humanitarian area, but sort of specific areas that are not tinged with, and President Trump would be well positioned, not tinged with the notion of regime change, regime toppling, but how can you make practical improvements, small improvements maybe it's incremental in the lives of North Koreans, and I personally would like to see that highlighted.
No, I think it was curious to see the pivot of President Trump away from his highlighting the human rights abuses. And, at his first State of the Union, he had, the family of that poor student who basically didn't survive captivity there. But I think, he's pivoted obviously because he's trying to keep this negotiation and discussion going with Kim Jongun. But I don't think Congress is going to let up on that. And I would expect the House Foreign Affairs Committee to traditionally both sides of the aisle in the House have focused heavily on democracy promotion, human rights issues, and so forth, humanitarian issues. I don't see that. I think that will continue, and it'll be very robust.
And Ambassador Zumwalt, it's a different kind of human rights issue, but I know Japan has been very focused on the abductee issue, and still is. So is that continuing, and is human rights in North Korea also part of that Japanese agenda?
The Japanese agenda certainly includes resolution of the issue of Japanese who were abducted from Japan and brought to North Korea. It's going to be a very tough issue to resolve, and I think the United States thus far has taken the very good approach of acknowledging this as a human rights concern, and because we support improvements in human rights, this is an issue that North Korea has to deal with. So fundamentally, it's a bilateral issue, or it's an issue between Japan and North Korea, but I think the U.S. support can be in terms of our values.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Yoon, I'll give you a question other than a yes-no question. It's more airtime. So New Year's address, Kim Jong-un called for sanctions relief and said that without it, the current process could be coming to an end.
Right.
Do you see administrations being open to sanctions relief, and when and what kind?
Yes, I think they are open to sanctions relief. It's just a question of what do we get by giving up sanctions or giving some relief to sanctions. And I think what is emerging from the New Year's address, he wants sanctions relief, in particular reopening Kaesong Industrial Complex and Mount Kumgang tours, And I think you are going to see an interesting jockeying of the positions, because South Korean government wants that too. So the question is, what is it that Washington can get for those items? Some sanctions relief and Kaesong and Kumgang. Now, I think we have to remember that for Washington policy community, we've for a long time regarded Kaesong Industrial Complex and Mount Kumgang tours as the backbone of foreign exchange earning that finance the missiles, especially the missile program and also the nuclear program. So it's going to be very, very, very hard to get Washington to agree on that. And so you have to look at what is it going to take from the other side, to go that far. And my view is that Kim Jong-un has hinted at two things which are worthwhile. The first is completely dismantling Yongbyon nuclear facility. And Yongbyon is, of course, their declared nuclear facility. It probably accounts for 60-70% of their work on fissile material and producing weapon-grade material. And then the second thing he said he could do in his New Year's address is the idea of freezing their nuclear program, which is no more production of fissile material for weapons and no more production of weapons. So, is that a fair swap? Getting Yongbyon plus a freeze for Kaesong and Kumgang. Maybe we should take a poll here, and decide, I think it's a decent swap, yeah.
I think the other important element of this, which is this does go then to managing the relationship between Washington and Seoul, with an awareness that if Kim Jong-un is feeling a little bit mischievous by putting out Mount Kumgang and Kaesong as something could be reopened, it could be a way of kind of wedge driving, right, between Seoul and Washington, because Seoul will be inclined to want to do that. And Washington may not. And I do think that Washington, we need to look at, really what our assumptions are about the value of these and also how they do fit into our desire to stay lashed up with our allies in Seoul. The Mount Kumgang tourist resort is a tourist resort, right? Is actually being closed to South Korean tourists who are the main visitors. Now I think Chinese go there, since 2008. So, at least since 2008, it wasn't a cash cow for the missile and nuclear program, which did continue. Part of my point is not that it's an insignificant source of foreign exchange. I grant that. And that it probably had not yet delivered on that notion that as people go in, it will gradually open the society and so on. There's a long way to go in all of that. But let's not, kind of over-exaggerate the financial impact and ignore the fact that North Korea has been very good at kind of staying a few steps ahead when it comes to finding other sources of income. And once we, there's a bit of a whack-a-mole to sanctions maintenance at all. So I agree with Joe, is what I come down to, that these are things that we should look at in light of, what can we get for them, and also how does it help to promote inter-Korean reconciliation in a way that does not undermine the work together that we do as allies with Seoul.
Yeah, I thought Kim Jong-un's statement sounded like a negotiation. When he said he would not test, produce, or use nuclear weapons, he said nothing about not keeping them. Mm-hmm. That feels like the bid. Mm-hmm. Congressman, you talked about the Congress having interest in sanctions in terms of Russia. Will Congress have a deep interest in what happens with sanctions towards North Korea?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. And I think there'll be a great deal of skepticism with regard to any move to lessen the sanction regime without seeing some real deliverables. And I think the House Foreign Affairs under Democratic control will raise that issue in a quite a forward way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's very true. I don't see them being willing to just sort of acquiesce if the administration were to just sort of unilaterally take a step to diminish the sanctions regime.
Okay, let me ask you too about the possible treaty. The administration's used the word treaty in regard to North Korea. The Republicans don't have enough votes in the Senate to be able to pass a treaty without Democratic support. So if we're approaching a treaty with North Korea, What will it take to get bipartisan approval?
That's a big hill to climb. I think a lot of work would need to be done on all the things we've just been covering. Really, whether it's human rights, it's our allies, the concerns of our allies, and the regional impact of what this means. So I think a lot will have to be done to build support and communicate this. And keep in mind, in the House alone, this is the biggest turnover in the House since Watergate, and most of those members who are serving now have only served, aside from the ones who just got elected, which is a large number, many of them have only served a couple of terms. So you've lost a lot of institutional experience and so forth. So I think there's a learning curve, but there's going to be a great deal of skepticism to just give the president carte blanche on a lot of these issues.
Ambassador Zumwalt, Ambassador Stevens talked about not calling for six-party talks to resume. She was explicit about that. But how much does Japan want to be involved in those talks going forward?
Japan very much would like to be involved because its interests are at stake. And just to give two examples, one is there's a great fear now in Japan that the United States would negotiate some kind of agreement that curtails North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missile program, but leaves in place its medium-range missiles, which threaten Japan. So they would like a place at that table when that discussion goes on to make sure their interests are accounted for. Another example is in the six-party process, when an agreement was reached, there was a feeling that the United States negotiated with North Korea on how much Japan was going to pay to participate, and they would like a place at the table if their finances are going to be involved in the negotiation. So one of the messages that the Japanese are saying is we have interests and we would like to be accounted for.
And I think this is one of those times when it's important just to kind of remind ourselves and that even when a negotiation is primarily a bilateral negotiation, for example, now I'm thinking of the Dayton Accords, if anybody remembers those, to settle the Bosnian conflict and some of the issues in the imploding Yugoslavia. That was regarded, I guess, right, as essentially, the U.S. negotiating, well, in this case, with some parties in the Balkans. But there are a lot of other people kind of, if not in the room, because there wasn't just one room, around that negotiation. Europeans who'd also be paying for it and staffing it and providing it. The Northern Ireland process is another one I'm familiar with. The Iran process. I realize traditional diplomacy is not a word that's probably, used with any favor in many parts of this town now, but traditional diplomacy is about garnering, it's like politics, I guess, getting your allies and your supporters together and then putting together a deal. And it seems like just that very basic concept, of what we sometimes call contact groups that often go on for a long time afterwards, because we also know that once you get an agreement, even if you don't have a treaty or you get some agreement, implementing it is a matter of decades usually. And I'm not saying in this case predicting it will be decades before North Korea has gotten rid of all its nuclear weapons, but any agreement is a long-term process, and you need to have all the support you can get around it as well as funding. So I do worry about, again, kind of the loss of that institutional muscle, if you like, that the U.S. has been a leader, but we haven't acted alone, and I don't see how we're going to get this thing worked out if we don't get that muscle back.
And then for Ambassador Yoon and Ambassador Stevens, then there's a sixth part of the six-party talks, not a traditional ally, but is Russia going to have to be brought on board at some point?
That's a yes or no question for you.
How will Russia be brought on to these?
Russia has become, certainly my experience talking with Russians about North Korea was quite productive. I think they have some good ideas, and they're not so wedded in one camp. Of course, Russians have an interest in reducing American influence and footprint over the Korean Peninsula. They share that with the Chinese. But I think their ideas, some of them are quite good, and which was why in six-party talks, they were made chair of the Northeast Peace and
Northeast
Security.
Northeast
Peace
Asia
and
Security
Security
Mechanism.
You know, and so
Whatever that means, right?
So I think they have something to add. Maybe if I can go back to the treaty issue, I think we have to remember that for United States, we got involved in the Korean War under the UN umbrella, and that was part of the UN police action. So the war was never declared. And the second thing we have to remember is that Chinese got involved as the volunteer, Chinese volunteer army. And so again, there was no war declaration there. So really, if you look at it, the conflict is between North and South, you know. And I'll pose this peace treaty or peace mechanism can be as complicated as you can make, if you want to make it. What does the UN do? What does it mean for US forces? China was a signatory. South Korea was not a signatory to the 1953 armistice. So you can make it complicated, and of course the likelihood the treaty will ever get to get past the Congress is probably 0 to 0. And so I think we need to, if you go forward, you need to simplify and try to make it a political issue rather than a strictly legal issue that you got to deal with all the bits and pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think there's a big difference between declaring peace and resolving the armistice.
Yeah.
Those aren't the same thing. It could be very complicated.
Could I just add to that too? We're going to. I agree with that, and I think it is. Talk in shorthand sometimes of a peace treaty or peace agreement to end the war, but there's a process that, again, I'm using the word process, but that then there's a lot of options. But one thing that I've heard, and I don't know if you all have, sometimes from directly or indirectly from voices from Pyongyang, shall we say, is this notion of, we have regime stability here. I'm not quoting anybody here, but sort of the message as I receive it is, we're predictable. We've been consistent. South Korea changes its government every 5 years. I think it's a good thing. And we change our governments and we have elections. But from the North Korean perspective is, you continually overturn agreements we've made. So I think there is, if you're trying, you have to try to look at it from Pyongyang's view too. How are we going to be sure that an agreement that any American president makes, or for that matter, South Korean president makes, is respected by the next administration? And, it's always pretty hard, I think, for an authoritarian or totalitarian regime to understand a democratic process in another country. But, I think they look and say, well, maybe one thing is to have something that's passed by the Congress, by the Senate, and I think they will be sensitive to what that is, especially given the experience of the agreed framework. But yeah, my recollection from my diplomatic days is even when you have a treaty like the Law of the Sea, which all parties support, and the U.S. Navy supports, we still can't ratify it. So I don't know if that's going to change in the U.S. Senate anytime in our
To your point,
lifetimes.
they saw the Trump administration pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement, and that further ingrains in their thinking that, hey, these agreements don't last. They're subject to the next administration and the whims of what happens politically, as opposed to being enshrined in some kind of legal construct.
Let's pivot a bit to the trilateral cooperation between U.S., Japan, and South Korea, the easy part. So, Ambassador Simbald, how would you describe kind of the state of the trilateral relationship, and what should we be doing to try to help it along?
Well, to be honest, the current state of the trilateral relationship is terrible, I think, and it's because of Japan-Korea relations being in such a low level. And I am quite concerned about, it's in the United States' interest to have a strong trilateral relationship. I think in the Obama administration there was a lot of work. Certainly the Deputy Secretary of State led talks with his Korean and Japanese counterparts that were quite productive. And the goal there was to look for areas where it's clearly in all of our interests and we can work together. I think now the ability to convene that kind of a discussion is pretty difficult. On the Japanese side, I think they used to use the word Korea fatigue, but I think it's worse than that now. I think there's quite a bit of anger, and even newspapers that used to be urging the government to work things out with Korea have stopped talking about that. So I guess my advice to my Japanese friends is twofold. One, don't make things worse on the leadership level. Try and avoid steps that only exacerbate the political problem on the other side. And two, begin looking to medium and long-term solutions that ultimately, over a long period of time, could lead to better relationships. Things like exchange programs and those parliamentary exchanges, journalist visits, and those sorts of things to try and build a consensus on both sides. But I think the number one issue, and I think this goes for both nations' leaders, is don't make things worse.
Do no harm.
Do no harm.
Yeah, that's right. So we build this conversation as being about Northeast Asia. So let me turn to China briefly for Ambassador Yun. On China, President Trump has talked about a strong personal relationship with Xi Jinping. The administration is confronting Beijing on trade. How does it view China as diplomatic and strategic partner?
I think we have seen a transformation of Trump administration policy, and where initially, for a number of reasons, past North Korea being the most important, that China, was seen as much needed, and so there was tremendous effort. But once North Korea, as far as Trump is concerned, you begin talking with them, begin negotiating with them, the need, was no longer there to get China to help out in the threat that was posed by North Korea. And so then I think the basic instinct of President Trump took over, which is on trade and, business. And there you're seeing much tougher policy. And that those policies have a lot of resonance within the United States, even within the business community, And so this is why I think you're seeing President Trump go to the brink in terms of trade war with them. But again, certainly we've always, the China that certainly when we joined Foreign Service is no longer the same China, it's gone through at least, 2 or 3, transformation from, once the normalization happened and there was, like China Dream, everyone thinking they're going to be an important stakeholder, they're going to join, these clubs like WHO, WTO, IMF, and so on. But I think to that some extent, the dream was shattered in late 80s over Tiananmen. And then you had a divided opinion after that, with people still saying China is a stakeholder, that cooperation can work, engagement can work. But I think that school is losing out now to the one that sees China as a strategic foe that we have to deal with. So that's where we are. And I would say that's the view, that's the emerging consensus view.
Could I add something to that? I agree, Joe, that there's an emerging view that China is a strategic foe on a broad array. But I think the debate is over what then do you do about it? And there I think there's a lot of criticism of the Trump administration's approach. Another way of dealing with China would be to use the multilateral system and use a regional system like TPP and engage like-minded partners to enhance the pressure on China. And instead, the U.S. government has done the opposite. We walked away from TPP, which was an effort to establish new rules that would regulate things like state-owned enterprises. We've not been very interested in WTO reform to address some of these challenges. And we've picked fights with most of the like-minded partners, the EU and Japan and Korea and others. So I think the debate is not over what is the status of China, it's more how do we deal with it? And there's some serious issues to discuss.
I think, again, you also have to try to think about how this looks from Beijing. And I think China and the United States continue to share an interest in generally stability in Northeast Asia. That means stability on the Korean Peninsula, and to share an interest in pursuit of that stability, as well as our shared, I think, non-proliferation goals, to see denuclearization. There's certainly progress in that direction, not a continual, arms buildup in Northeast Asia. So that's something to work towards. But going in the other direction, you have a China which has said, long before Xi Jinping, but for some time, that they regard U.S. alliances in Northeast Asia as anachronisms and vestiges of the Cold War that have no place in the modern world, that China is looking to resume its natural role, and whether we mean a natural role as of, the Qing dynasty but a greater role for China and the influence in the area. And I'm concerned they see some opportunities here. Because we have an American administration, which is, and a president specifically, who has said that he feels that alliances are not so much of an asset for the United States, that he is not eager to see the United States continue to have troops deployed overseas in every situation. In the case of Korea, he's been quite specific about that. So, although as we've seen over the past couple of years, however our process is, reverse engineering or however it looks, we sometimes end up in a place where I think we need to be in terms of our own national interests. Nonetheless, I think if you're sitting in Beijing, you see some opportunities there, kind of longer term, for changing the power relationships in Northeast Asia, especially vis-a-vis the alliances. But at the same time, maybe trying to ensure that you maintain that relationship with North Korea and, address the denuclearization issue in a way that perhaps satisfies President Trump. I'm kind of outlining a scenario which kind of on a more of a worrisome side, if you like, from, I think, the point of view of U.S. goals. But I think that's something we have to pay attention to.
I think the longest time we've engaged with China without purpose. And taking a step back and looking at what's consistent with China is the fact that leader after leader since Mao has always put the party and the party interests first, and Xi Jinping now has doubled down on that system, which to get to structural changes, whether it's intellectual property, enforced technology transfers, or subsidies at state-owned enterprises, it's going to be very difficult because the kinds of reforms we're going to be asking them to undertake will undermine the party's grip, I think, ultimately, on what's happening there. So there's a fundamental contradiction, and that's where the lines will be drawn. I think we're going to have to figure out what are our rules of engagement and what are we trying to achieve. I think there are a number of issues where we do align, and there are a number of issues where we don't. To get China to undertake more difficult changes will take a significant multilateral effort where you aggregate leverage and put them in a position where it's in their interest to make the change. They have to make the choice because I don't think anybody can force them at the end of the day. Whether that kind of aggregated leverage would be successful or not remains to be seen. We don't know. It's not been tried yet. And so I think diplomatic efforts ought to be made to build that kind of approach to China without calling it containment and just, kind of what we were trying to start with TPP. And it'll have to play out over time. In the meantime, I think we just have to figure out where do you draw the line? What are those? Where do we engage? Where we have aligned interest? Where do we engage in opposition? And how do we use the international architecture and strengthen it? Because to some extent, that's our home turf. We created that after the Second World War. You don't want to, degrade that architecture because I think it ultimately degrades our own legitimacy. Let's look at how do we build consensus with other countries to work within that architecture when we do have to oppose.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm almost through with my question. I'll turn to the audience, so let me just pose three more quick ones. First, Professor Stevens and Professor Zumwalt, could you summarize the state of South Korean-China relations and the state of Japan-China relations to get the bigger context? It's not just the U.S.
Too historical. South Korea and China only established diplomatic relations as a modern diplomatic relationship in 1992, so it's actually fairly recent. I think they went through, if you like, a long honeymoon period because the economic relationship boomed so dramatically. And in fact, I think South Korea is by some measures the most reliant on trade with China of any country. It's very deeply embedded. The last several years have been a little rocky, especially over this issue of the THAAD deployment, the deployment of the defense, the radar system in South Korea to address the growing North Korean threat. And I don't think it's really kind of recovered from that in many ways, certainly in terms of public attitudes and popular attitudes. So I think it's a more, from the South Korean perspective, they're a little bit more, if you like, sobered and realistic about about China's big footprint in the area and its readiness to use its economic clout to get its broader policy objectives. Because if you like, the sanctions against against South Korea continue. I think in terms of tourism, group tourism is still pretty much dried up from China. And a variety of other things. At the same time, South Korea, sorry, it's not a long answer now, but South Korea is feeling always the hot breath of larger countries around the area in economics, and that includes Japan as well and China, and they've tried to stay on that edge by, risking more, innovating more if they can, and getting out there into new markets. I think they feel under tremendous pressure right now. I mean, you can say the world does, but I think they feel under tremendous pressure right now from China, and the economy looms very large. That's why I think they're very happy to have the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement improved, Trump version, ratified. So they're a little bit more secure in that respect, but they watch, I think, with great concern the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S. commitment in the area.
Speaking of China-Japan relations, I think in some ways it's very similar to what Congressman Boustany said about U.S.-China relations. There's some areas where the relationship is good and others where it's problematic. Japan has been a tremendous beneficiary over the last 30 years of Chinese dramatic economic growth. Japanese firms have invested heavily in China and have been doing pretty well there. So there's and recently huge increases in Chinese inbound tourism into Japan. I think last year, not just Chinese, but there was a total of 24 million tourists that came to Japan, which is double the amount it was 5 years earlier. And now they've set a new goal of 30 million inbound tourists. And many of those will, if they reach their goal, will come from China. So that's on the plus side. But on the minus side, Japan does feel a threat from China's growing and robust security capabilities. Japan has a territorial dispute with China in the East China Sea. They have territorial disputes with Korea and Russia as well, but the difference there is their disputes with Russia and Korea, the other side occupies the territory. So there's little they can do about the northern territories or about Dokdo. But in case of the Senkaku Islands, they have administrative control, and the Chinese are aggressively contesting that control. So that dispute is much more in the news in Japan. And I think just in general, the Japanese feel the threat of gradually becoming less relevant and more being forced to bow to Chinese will. So far, Japan's response has been to enhance its security ties with the United States. And I think there would be a desire to improve security relations with South Korea as well. So it's very much a mixed bag. In the last year, the Prime Minister Abe traveled to China, and I think that succeeded at least in restoring Japan-China relations to the low level it was at 4 or 5 years ago. But I don't see a possibility of dramatic further improvement given the pretty severe differences between the two sides.
Yeah, thank you. I've got my last questions for Congressman Boustany. It's a bit technical and specific, but it's really important. It's about the Section 232 trade authority.
Okay.
So in the last Congress, there were concerns about how administration was using that provision regarding national security concerns and trade policy. So if the administration finds that automotive imports are damaging national security and places tariffs on automotive exporting countries, such as Korea, how do you think Congress will react to that?
Well, I think with Section 232 on steel and aluminum, you saw a little bit of a pushback. And I mentioned, I don't recall if I mentioned Senator Thune now, who is on the Senate Finance Committee, has expressed more of an interest in looking at this. I think with automotives, this will hit more congressional districts than the steel issue alone, and I think it will gather a lot of attention, and some of it negative toward the Trump approach on this. In the House, a lot of conversations I've had with Republicans in the House, they have been very critical of the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, but they've been voicing it quietly among themselves, sometimes with the Trump administration, but they've not been very publicly vocal on this, as opposed to a few of the senators who have been more vocal on it. But I think in the automotive section side of it, if that happens, I think it will be much more impactful, and I think there will be more pushback.
Okay, thank you. So we've reserved 15 minutes for the audience. So, yes, sir, please. Do we have a microphone? Microphone's on the way up.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I understand there's quite a polarization in South Korea about between the conservatives and maybe what we call liberal left. So liberal left is Moon and his policies of the current government, and conservatives. When I hear the people in D.C. speaking, it's almost very much along the lines solely of the view of the conservatives in the South. So first, I'm just wondering, is there anybody in the previous Congress or the new Congress who actually is enthusiastic in any way about the policies of the Moon regime? And then secondly, to follow up on Professor Stevens' remark about the economic squeeze on South Korea between, China's technological advances, I think it's not just maybe leftists or whatever, if you want to call them that, as the conservatives do, who are looking towards the north, but it's also the conservatives in the South Korean conglomerates, the Chaebol family. So when Moon went to the north, he brought the Chaebols with him. So they're thinking of a kind of economic unification under some guise of the two states, not political and economic, which will create a powerhouse in South Korea economically, the way German reunification essentially did in Europe, and stave off the challenge from China. So it's not just maybe there's no sympathy for Moon here, but maybe we're making a big mistake not seeing the sort of economic necessity for the Koreans to go this route.
Yeah, I think so-called liberals in South Korea and progressive, whatever you want to call it, the reason why they are not getting as much traction in Washington or United States is because at extreme, liberals in South Korea has defined themselves as wanting self-determination, sovereignty, which means ending the alliance relationship. Okay? So you're not going to get much support in Washington if you say we want to end the alliance relationship. Now, I think they will say that's unfair on us, but I'm saying at an extreme. So the liberals or progressive in South Korea really have two groups, what I would call alliance supporters and sovereignty supporters, national sovereignty. And so that's the reason why, in general, U.S. policies are more consistent with the conservative group. Now, that's not to say that President Moon, or he is following the extreme side, but there are clearly elements within the Blue House who would like, to have a true reconciliation with North Korea. They feel they need much more, at least complete self-determination.
There's a question here. Yes. Right in the middle.
Gregory Ho from Radio Free Asia. This question is about the U.S.-China trade war. There's only less than 30-some days for the two sides to make a deal. It looks like promising in Beijing today. My question is, would Japan or South Korea benefit from this trade war, or what is the position of these two nations with America or with China? Thank you. Last but not the least, are there any real chance that the trade war will begin from March the 1st? Thank you.
I think the pressure on both sides on Xi and on Trump is to get some kind of deal, which will probably have an element of mutually agreed upon market access. A lot of that's been bandied around in the press. China will highlight this new modification to the 2015 law dealing with joint ventures, saying we're reforming, we're moving forward. There'll be new commitments probably on IP protections. And so I think they can get to something. Then the big issue is how hard a line will Lighthizer insist on the process to verify all this. That's where I'm a little uncertain to where, what he'll advise the president. My guess is that there will be sort of an extended truce period. So there'll be this sort of package of things that they agree upon with ongoing negotiations for further things and sort of a test period. That's what I think may happen, to buy time, let the market settle down. I suspect the Chinese are going to try to, underlying their whole approach to this is to wait out Trump, string him along, wait him out, and then it's back to business, status quo. But I think there's going to be an attempt on both sides to kind of still the waters a little bit, because China's dealing with its own deleveraging issue and its debt problem and some of the economic headwinds. And of course, I think Trump is spooked by what happened with the stock market here.
I just say very generally, I think the South Koreans really worry about being kind of collateral damage. There's the old proverb that Koreans used to say all about their geopolitical situation of, when the whales fight, the shrimp is crushed, and they're not a shrimp anymore. Some people say they're a dolphin. But I've heard Koreans use this in connection with the trade war. And I mean, we had a speaker in here, just a very small example of the South Korean solar panel industry, which got caught up in the tariffs on solar panels aimed at China, and it wasn't the intent, but they got hit and very much affected in a very negative way. So I think there's a lot of worry.
I think the same for Japan, that Japan would very much like to see China and the U.S. avoid a trade war.
Lady in white.
Florence Lowly, Global America Business Institute. Good to see you all. Congressman Boustany mentioned briefly about energy and energy cooperation. And you said a similar remarks at our event in December. And at the time, and perhaps now, you and many of us are talking about oil, LNG, clean coal, and others. But Kim Jong-un mentioned during his New Year's remark about nuclear power as their source of electricity for growth. Is it a wish list, or is there some possibility? And how are we in the U.S. and U.S. Congress will take that?
Yeah, that's an interesting twist on it. I know, and looking at South Korea's plan, we had talked about this before. President Moon was backing away from nuclear, looking to be more to enhance LNG exports to fill the needs across different sectors, along with some renewables. And then the role of nuclear remains uncertain. And what bothers me a little bit on our side here in the U.S. is that it's been at such a standstill for a while. I think we've lost a lot of expertise in that area, and that's disturbing to me, especially as we've seen the gas opportunities, arise and fulfill a lot of our energy needs here. So we're losing a lot of expertise in that area. Nuclear will probably end up having to play a role on the peninsula, and how this politically plays out with regard to any kind of rapprochement between North and South, how does that play out in the American congressional view of this? Could be kind of complicated, at the very least.
Mr. Humphrey.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I think when you're talking about freezes, you have to add uranium mining. I look at the imagery and it's clear that nothing's changed since Singapore. My guess is what's going to happen is Kim Jong-un is going to sell his nuclear weapons, since they're largely useless, to the United States, $1 billion a pop, something like that. That'll get him $40-50 billion. And then the last 10 will be hidden in the 10 prison camps and the prison camps will be declared off limits to inspection. So that's my guess is what's going to happen. Given that there are 10 cities potentially vulnerable, why haven't we denuclearized the peninsula overnight by declaring no first use, guaranteed second use?
Well, I think that's been done. If you look at SixParty Talks agreement, there is a statement on no first use. So it's been done before, and to me, dealing with these issues, no first use or freeze or whatever, does not get to the fundamental problems. And again, you cannot put it down on paper. The fundamental problem is there is such high degree of mistrust, and you cannot get over that mistrust until you slowly begin a relationship. And so I that is the problem. There is no relationship between United States and North Korea. There is not even a liaison office. I mean, U.S. citizens are not allowed to travel there. So unless you begin to address these issues of how do you have any confidence on each other's say, the items like no first strike, I don't think is very meaningful.
Guaranteed second use is the one I'm concerned about. I've seen no such statement in any document anywhere.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's been done on second use, but certainly we've done security guarantees based on first use.
But I think we have, in our extended deterrence commitments to our allies, we have said the United States would respond appropriately to a nuclear strike. So I think that has been stated.
Mr. Hershowitz.
Congressman Boustany, my name is Nicholas Amasevich, PhD candidate at Catholic University. You talk about looking at things through the prism of the 2020 election. Can you talk about, like, for Congress, kind of the timeline and how it might be kind of crunched because of that prism? And are the investigative actions and hearings, we see them kind of up front and then it kind of dies off as we get toward election ramping up of candidates and
Yeah, when I first took office in 2005, January 2005, for about 4 or 5 years after that, we would have a period of time, anywhere from 6 months, 8, 9 months of work that was really legislative. We actually kind of got along and did things and tried to get legislation done. Then, as you got into the late summer, coming back from the August recess in particular, after that first year, you began the political year and things got progressively more political as you went on. That has completely changed. That's gone. It is nonstop politics. And I mean, look what happened. I mean, right almost immediately after the midterm elections, you have the Democratic primary already significantly underway with announced candidates and others. So there's really no reprieve. And part of this is fueled by not only the 24/7 news cycle, but you have the constant social media scrutiny. There is no space whatsoever for members of Congress anymore because the combination of the money, social media, and all this has eliminated that. So everything is done under the glaring lights of politics. And this has fueled the political dysfunction in our system. And I don't see an easy fix to that, and I certainly don't see it going away. So we're already in the heat of battle with 2020 elections now. Everything's going to be kind of viewed as such, and I think you'll see a lot of politics being played with these hearings and investigations. Both parties do it, and that's going to be the circumstances we're going to be under. And it's not a healthy set of circumstances by any means.
Yeah, that's one change. The other change is that the pressure of time is so great now that incoming administrations need to show results in the first 100 days.
Yeah.
So they don't have time to consult with the foreign policy establishment about what they might do, what the options are. They need to come into office with an agenda in mind already. It makes it very difficult. Yes, sir.
Thank you all. This is Takawa Haren from Okinawa Prefecture, Washington DC office. Always honored to hear your perspectives from KEI and Sasakawa USA, Korea, USA, and Japan. Now, like maybe decades ago, when people in the United States hear the name of, for example, Samsung, they might think of maybe suitcase. But the situation has changed. I want to say that the global economy is so intertwined. We are dependent on each other. In that sense, my first question would be, where does Mr. Trump's trade policy, which may lead to the potential trade war, will lead us? Or what is the bottom line on that? And build on that, my second question is, does his policy may have an impact on the security situations in the East Asia, which may require flexibility in response by the U.S., Japan. For example, U.S. government, U.S. Congress, and others. For example, like flexibility, for example, in case of Okinawa, for example. Thank you.
Yeah.
Where's this all end?
Well, what's happening is clearly having an impact on supply chains. I've been reading a lot of the articles about Apple, for instance, in China and its loss of market share. Samsung has really seen a contraction in market share. And what's happening with a lot of supply chains, especially those with embedded IP, is where the economics and the security side sort of dovetail. I don't see this getting better in the short run. I think it's going to get worse. And how this plays out, what determines how these shifts are conducted will matter a lot, because you can either see a sort of a controlled approach to it with realignment, or you can see it just really spin out of control and a lot of commercial entities getting hurt bad, and with all the impact on jobs and the broader economy. That's my big concern, that you get this, what I've called relatively an uncontrolled decoupling or disengagement with a separation of economic blocks. I hope it doesn't get to that. It's going to take some very, I think, astute and deft economic diplomacy to avoid that kind of thing. Now, on top of that, if you look at CPTPP, Japan's central positioning in that, Japan with the EU, where they've got a pretty good agreement, they've come to agreement on technology. Some of those things will define supply chain and business flow. And my big concern is the U.S. is left out of all of that. And the United States has 14 free trade agreements. The only top 20 economy in that's clearly included would be South Korea, because we have an agreement with South Korea. Canada's at risk. There's no guarantee we're going to see ratification of the new version of NAFTA. And if the president pulls out of the old one, which he's threatening to do, we could find ourselves more and more isolated from supply chain, our commercial entities separated out from supply chains. That's the big risk. And I think that's what's been factored into the market lately with all the volatility in the stock market. My big question was, why did it take so long for the stock market to react to this? I kept seeing these headwinds, building up. So those are the concerns. And there's a security component, because if you have, China, at least according to the number of press reports, has increased its theft of intellectual property through cyber means and other types of industrial espionage. There's a security element clearly linked to all of that, and that's going to fuel a lot of what happens with all of this.
I mean, if I think you asked the fundamental question of, where does this all lead? And I think this year is going to be, I don't know, is my answer, but this year is going to be incredibly important. And as to whether or not what we're seeing is in both in terms of, I guess I would say, the post-World War II economic as well as security architecture, a kind of, and the rise of populism and protectionism and isolation in the case, is it just a pendulum swing, which we have seen before in our own history, or are we at the precipice of something really
Bigger.
transformational, and perhaps not in a good way for those of us who like to see more of a swing of the pendulum back the other way? But in the meantime, when it comes to South Korea, and I imagine Japan as well, I think what we're seeing is the beginning of some hedging. And that's not a bad thing, but hedging in terms of South Korea looking to develop markets in the so-called Southern strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, and this has to do obviously not only with developments here, but also perceptions of where China might go.
Okay, time for one more question. To be here, front on the right, yes.
Tammy Overby with McClarty Associates.
Mike's on the way.
Thank y'all for your comments. I just wanted to end with CPTPP and Ambassador Stevens, your comments about countries hedging. American farmers have just been blocked. December 30th, the first 6 countries of CPTPP goes into effect. So Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Canada, their farmers are going to take advantage of that. And then with the EU agreement with Japan, how long will Congress and how long will American farmers be able to hold out? Because they're getting crushed now, and it's going to get a lot worse. I'd be interested in all of your take of, how long does this last?
Tammy, I've heard from farmers who are under severe stress, and we're seeing a spike in bankruptcies in farm country. But yet, interestingly, even many of the soybean farmers who have been most hit by this, many of them are still saying,
They're wearing the red hat.
That's right. They're saying, we're willing to take this pain now because we think there's something better on the other end. And I don't know. I've been asking that question. I'm trying to understand where the inflection point really lies. And I'm starting to see more comments in the media, in interviews with farmers, suggesting that no, we got to do something different. Now, how long will that take to bubble up and put pressure on Congress to really push back on the administration remains to be seen. I thought we were headed that direction with all the volatility in the stock market. We're getting a little temporary reprieve with the discussions going on in Beijing right now. I think even if we get an uneasy truce with Beijing, it's only going to be temporary, and this will flare again. That's a big concern. I think we need a real strategy with regard to China and how to deal with it. It's much more complicated than what the administration's portraying. I think he's overselling the impact of tariffs in this and underselling the collateral damage that has followed from the tariffs.
That light is coming, and it's a train, and it's going to crush us.
It's going to be very painful. I mean, all these supply chains are shifting. Brazil's selling more soybeans. We're not going to get those markets back anytime soon. And yeah.
Okay, our time's drawn to an end. So I think for a collection of former officials elected and appointed, we've heard some remarkably frank, open views from our panelists. So I appreciate that very much. One thing I always notice when I go to a panel conversation in Washington, D.C. is how many people wear glasses. And here again, all 5 of us are wearing eyeglasses. So I'm not sure if that shows this line of work is tough on the eyes, or if we're trying to see things really clearly. But in either way, join me in thanking the panelists for
Yeah, he forgot to mention that.